Agenda.
Hello and welcome to AM Agenda. I'm Laura Jays, and today, just as the Labor Party has been talking about unifying, moving on and leaving the messy past behind, the former Attorney General Nicola Roxon has reopened old wounds. In a speech last night, she dedicated much of it to criticising Kevin Rudd, a scathing character assessment of his leadership style and how he treated his colleagues. She talked about him as a leader that was concentrating on the minutiae instead of tackling some of the big problems when Labor was in government. She's called on Kevin Rudd to resign from politics altogether and justified his knifing as Prime Minister the first time round in 2010 because she says he was a bastard to so many people.
Moving Kevin was an act of political bastardry, for sure. But this act of political bastardry was made possible only because Kevin had been such a bastard himself to so many people already.
Plenty to get to on the show today. We'll look at parliamentary expenses as well, the latest in the travel rorts, and also the latest when we look at what the political parties are doing when it comes to the carbon tax. So joining me on my panel today is Labor MP Ed Husic in Sydney and Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer in Melbourne. Now, Ed, first to you. You are a Kevin Rudd supporter. You were a Kevin Rudd supporter. I'm assuming you still are. Was anything of what Nicola Roxon said last night true?
I'm a supporter of the Labor Party, and what I get told a lot by Labor voters and Labor members is that the type of free analysis and free public commentary that should be reserved for behind closed doors is not welcome publicly, and Labor voters and members want to see us focus on our job at hand, which is to be an effective opposition. So I think former Prime Ministers, be they Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard, should be respected as former leaders of our party. I'm not going to entertain going into those type of character analyses that have been undertaken so far, and I just don't see how it helps. I think people are sick to the back teeth of that type of commentary.
Yeah, and Nicola Roxon, this is not the first time, and she's not the first of your colleagues to come out and criticise Kevin Rudd, but why do you think now? And perhaps the second part of my question here is, does the party need to do this to move on?
Labor talking about itself, I don't know if that's a winning combination or formula. At this point in time, our job is to be an effective opposition. I think on either side, I've previously spoken out about people that take these type of free shots internally directed on a outside panel, be it at a speech or on TV. I just don't think it helps. I think Labor voters don't see the value in it. And as I said, I think there is a job to respect former Prime Ministers and their role, both in terms of the legacy of Julia Gillard and the things that Kevin Rudd did in his both occasions as Prime Minister.
And do you think he should stay on the backbench, stay in Parliament, or would he be a distraction?
I don't know. Labor causing a by-election on its own is a wise thing to do, but the bottom line is for Kevin, that's a decision ultimately that he has to make, but he also views, from what I know, very seriously his responsibility as the member for Griffith, that he has a job to do for his local constituents, and that he should be given the opportunity to fulfil that. He's been elected to the job, he should do it.
Okay, Kelly O'Dwyer, you saw parts of this Nicola Roxon speech last night. You've at least seen it reported this morning. What's your assessment of it? Is it damaging for the Labor Party, or do they need to go through this to move on?
Well, Laura, I don't think anybody was surprised by the speech that was delivered by Nicola Roxon last night. The Labor Party has got a culture of cover-up. We've seen that just this week with the former president of the ALP, Mike Williamson, committing a great fraud on the HSU, and all of that being covered up. We've seen that as well with the Eddie Obeid scandal. And last night, Nicola Roxon exposed the great cover-up that was the ALP cover-up of the flaws of Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, a man that the Labor Party didn't think was fit to be Prime Minister, they put up again to the Australian people to be Prime Minister. And they were silent on his flaws. They did it because it was all about power. They did it not because it was about good policy, but because it was about holding on to their jobs. And I think the Australian people are absolutely fed up with that.
Well, Nicola Roxon did doubt that Kevin Rudd was able to save seats that Julia Gillard may not have been able to. What's your assessment of that, Kelly O'Dwyer? Do you think he saved seats in Western Sydney? I mean, not one seat was lost in Queensland, for example.
Well, I think what the Australian people want to hear about is what is the Australian government going to do to make their lives, their businesses, their communities even better. And the Labor Party completely and utterly lost the plot on that. They weren't able to articulate a vision for our country. They were only able to talk about themselves. They were hugely dysfunctional. They still are. Nothing has actually changed since before the election to after the election. They're not a united team. We've seen that with all of the blow-ups over the last week in particular. And the Australian people want a united team, an adult team, to lead them. They want people who have actually thought about policy and who are prepared to implement that policy, people who can follow through. They want a team that are doers, and that is what our government will deliver.
Ed Husic, one of the things that Nicola Roxon was quite positive about was the Labor leadership contest that you've just been through. All in all, do you think it was a time spent in limbo, or was the result something that did re-energise the rank and file, and did it put you in good stead for a stint in opposition and perhaps getting back to government?
Yeah, I think it definitely, you took the words that I was going to use myself in terms of re-energising the party, and certainly members that I've spoken to have really valued the opportunity to have a say on one of the most important issues affecting the party, and that is the leadership, and not just in terms of the people that fill the role, but having a chance to hear the type of ideas and the policy agenda that will be pursued by anyone who does secure the position of leadership. So I think on a range of levels it's been really important and helpful, and I think it is something that, as Chris Bowen said, we're the first major political party to open up these decision-making processes, significant decision-making processes, in such a way, and I think it's an important step forward, which I imagine that in years to come the Liberal Party will want to undertake as well, because I think it does give a lot more power to the role of members and increase the value of that membership for individuals.
Well, Bill Shorten did make much of breaking down the factions when he was campaigning for the role, but in putting together the shadow ministry, well, you've missed out on a frontbench position, and you were long touted as someone who might take on some of the key portfolios. What's happened here? Have you been a victim of this factional divide?
We've got a lot of people who can fill roles that aren't available, and so you're going to have people that get those positions and others that don't. I mean, them's the breaks, as I've said publicly, for us. And again, going back onto words that I mentioned earlier, we've got a job to do as an opposition, be an effective opposition that holds the government to account for the promises that they seem to be backing away from now that they're in government, and we've got to get on with that.
Okay, Kelly O'Dwyer, are you, as a Liberal Party, as Ed Husic suggests, going to take on any of these new leadership rules? Is there any lessons that the coalition...
Well, Laura, I think I've just lost you now, so hopefully you can still hear me. But what I was going to say in response to Ed's comments before was that, he's trying to make a virtue out of the fact that the Labor membership have had a say. But when you actually look at what they said, is that they said that they wanted to support Anthony Albanese as leader, not Bill Shorten. So in fact, they have been completely and utterly ignored. They didn't get the leader that they asked for. They wanted Anthony Albanese. They got Bill Shorten. So they can't make a virtue out of the fact that the Labor membership have had a say, because they've been completely ignored. I don't think that there is too much that we can learn from the Labor Party example, other than to learn the lessons of history. They are a great test case on what not to do.
on Bob Carr staying in the Senate, there's been report after report that he is going to quit in coming weeks. Is that what you're picking up?
He's likely to finish up his job as senator, but we'll leave that to him to make his decision whenever he makes it.
Okay, Ed Cusick, Kelly O'Dwyer, stay with us. So when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about what has been in the newspapers for 3 weeks running now, and that is parliamentary entitlements and travel expenses. We'll also look at the carbon tax. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
At Shell, we're working hard to broaden the world's energy mix, supplying natural gas for the generation of electricity with around half the CO2 emissions of coal, producing biofuel made from renewable sugarcane with our partner in Brazil, and here in Australia, finding ways to fuel our future. Let's broaden the world's energy mix. Let's go.
We did it.
Wow. Wow. It's perfect.
Aw, you did it.
Open your heart. To have you by my side.
Most home loans feel like they're going to stick around forever.
To me.
But not at Westpac. Most of our Rocket Repay customers are ahead on their home loan. Home Owns, proudly supported by Westpac.
Today, Trafalgar invited us to Jean-Pierre and Evelyn's home.
Everyone got a kiss.
This family run a vineyard that just took us all in.
And we spent days sitting under a beautiful big tree. Sun was shining, great food, and the wine was magic.
Experiencing this local secret, completely hidden away, was just amazing.
Hi, I'd like a top 10 ranking in next year's emerging.coms. Globally. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Come this way.
Create professional work with this HP notebook, now an incredible $479. And enjoy quality printing with this wireless Fuji Xerox mono laser printer, now an amazing $79. Plus, we've got over 20,000 items online too.
Oh, cool.
If you've got the big ideas, Officeworks has the lowest prices.
Coles Unreal Deals! Abbott's Village Bakery bread, half price at just $2.62 a loaf! Just $2.62 a loaf? That's unreal, Cole! Unreal deals on Abbott's bread, for real, at Coles.
Start up like this. Or like this. And hit the start button to flip back and forth. You can make the important things big. Keep the small stuff small. And arrange it all around you. You can be all work. All play, or even both at the same time. You can do it all, simpler and easier, on your Windows tablet, PC or Surface. That's the new Windows. One experience for everything in your life.
Are you often hampered by pain in your heels, knees or back? Your feet could be out of alignment. Scholl Orthohill realigns feet to their natural position so you can move in comfort. Ask your pharmacist for the Scholl Orthotics range.
Well, Liberal MP Don Randall has been the latest politician to be caught up in the expenses scandal. This has been a long-running story for about 3 weeks, with the PM, MP after MP seeming to be caught up in rules that do have a grey area. Now, Don Randall is looking at $10,000 of taxpayers' money, questionable expenses, including money linked to a property investment in Cairns. Now, so far, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, hasn't given really any signal that he's willing to clamp down on these rules, but the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen, says he should.
Tony Abbott says, I'm not changing the rules and there's nothing to see here. I think he's showing that he's a bit out of touch with community expectations here. I do think the grey areas have been exploited, and we've seen another instance today of a Liberal MP who's got questions to answer here, and if he won't answer them, I think Tony Abbott should. Because there are some claims which are very, very questionable.
Kelly O'Dwyer, does Tony Abbott need to do something here? As I say, this story has been 3 weeks running now. Don Randall's not the first, and he's not going to be the last either.
Well, the Labor Party, of course, are whipping up a frenzy in relation to entitlement issues, and they do that, I think, a little bit at their own peril, because, of course, we've seen all sorts of people have to pay back entitlements that they've been provided. Tony Burke is one, Julia Gillard is another. Mark Dreyfus, more famously over that 3-week period, has also had to pay back some expenses. I think the key point here is that everybody ought to act within entitlement, and that if there are any questions regarding that, then people need to speak to the Finance Department to ensure that they are acting within entitlement. No one, and I don't think anybody on the Labor side or the Liberal Party, wants to see taxpayer money abused, and nor should it be, and we must be absolutely clear on that point. But if there are any questions, then that's obviously a matter for the Finance Department, who administer this entitlement scheme.
But Kelly O'Dwyer, the coalition is now in government. You have the power to change the rules and make sure that there is no longer this grey area. Why is Tony Abbott, why is the Prime Minister resisting so much here? Surely it'd be, you could just tighten the rules and prevent this from happening in the future.
Well, the rules are clear on what is within entitlement and not within entitlement, but there are always matters of judgment around the edges, and it will always be thus, no matter what rules you put into place. So people have to make their judgments. They have to ask questions of the Finance Department if they are not sure regarding their entitlement, and then they need to act appropriately. You know, that to me has been a pretty successful system to date. It was a system that operated previously under the Labor government. It's exactly the same system that operates today, and I think it's very interesting that Labor are trying to fill the void with their dysfunction with these sorts of stories.
But doesn't it concern you that Don Randall is across the front page of the paper today, $10,000 worth of questionable expenses, including travel linked to a Cairns property investment? How is that exploiting a grey area? That's not using good judgment at all. We're talking about significant amounts of taxpayer money here.
As I said to you before, and I'm sorry to say it again to you, Laura, everybody needs to act within entitlement. If you've got questions for Don Randall or the Special Minister of State, then I suggest you put those questions to the relevant individuals. But everybody needs to act within entitlement, act appropriately and safeguard taxpayer money. And that was the system under the previous Labor government. It's the system that exists today. There will always be matters of judgment, and people need to be able to make sure that they make the right sort of judgments in consultation with the Finance Department.
Okay, Ed Husic, the Labor government was in power for 6 years. They didn't change the rules when they had a chance to. You didn't change the rules when you had a chance to. And this is not just a scandal that's been on the coalition side of politics. Some of your own colleagues have been caught up in this.
Well, the coalition, as you rightly point out, in government now, and it's apparent that a number of MPs on their side, when confronted with the choice of dipping into their own pocket or the public purse, have opted for the public purse, and it's simply not acceptable for Kelly O'Dwyer to say, oh, well, this is just something that the Labor Party's focused on. The general public is focused on it, and I'll tell you why they are, Laura. When the front page of The Australian says that ministers are being told to rein in spending, they're cutting funds from crime prevention programs, for instance, while at the same time finding funds to go off to weddings, fill out entitlements for book purchases that simply don't meet the test. And now we're having, in terms of Don, Don's, I noticed that he used the defence today that he was using those purchases for community groups. That entitlement for book purchases are for individual MPs for the benefit of their role as an MP. If he wants to do that for community groups, as we all do, he should be using his electorate allowance for it. There is not an issue of grey area here. These things have been used in the improper way, and there are people that will lose out because the coalition is cutting programs, cutting grants, cutting funding, while at the same time not making the right choices when it comes to their own travel entitlements.
Kelly O'Dwyer, I'll let you respond to that, but I do want to get on to the carbon tax. There's a report today, modelling suggesting that if the coalition, the government, doesn't repeal the carbon tax legislation by the promised June 30 deadline, well, the government could be up to $4 billion in compensation.
Well, that, Laura, is simply not correct. We are very confident that the legislation that we have put out for exposure, for proper consultation with industry, with stakeholders, with the general public, very different, of course, to Labor's approach, is legislation that will deal with all sorts of contingencies. We are very confident as well that the Labor Party will come to its senses, will listen to the Australian people and will pass this legislation that so clearly received a mandate in the recent federal election.
Ed Husic, will the Labor Party pass this repeal legislation?
So we'll go through the legislation and make obviously the shadow cabinet and the caucus will make a decision ultimately on what we have to do. The coalition is hell bent on this dog of a policy, direct action. It is a complete waste of money. No credible economist, no credible scientist will back that this will even achieve the 5% emission reduction target by 2020, and we've already heard Environment Minister Greg Hunt say that they won't put any more money in it, even if it looks like it's going to miss the target. They won't spend any more, which means we'll clearly miss the imperative of reducing our emissions when other nations are going above 5% and look on track to actually treble their emissions cut. Instead of making a choice to ensure through a market-based mechanism that we reduce emissions, they're going to throw a whole stack of money, Laura, at subsidising polluters, crossing their fingers and hoping that will work, while other people see things
said
cut
yesterday
out.
that he agrees with Tony Abbott that the carbon tax needs to go. So was he opening the way to, in fact, Labor not standing in the way of repealing this legislation, abstaining in the Senate, for example?
Before the election, we announced a policy to effectively end the fixed price by bringing forward the ETS. And I think there are a number of people, and I just speak as one individual MP that will be taking my voice into the caucus, that says I agree with the policy that we took to the last election, that we have a market-based mechanism in the form of the ETS, that we dispense of the fixed price. So do you think
Labor should go to the next election promising to reinstate an ETS?
Well, the next election is 3 years away, but for the here and now, where we're confronted with the legislation that's before us and our own policy position we took to the election, we set an ETS. So I think that a market-based mechanism beats a subsidy in the form of what the opposition's doing with direct action, one that won't be backed by anyone, by an economist or scientist. It is a waste of money and we will lose out as a result of it.
Okay, Kelly O'Dwyer, just quickly get your reaction to that. Now, is the coalition still willing to go to a double dissolution, or would they rather negotiate with Clive Palmer in the new Senate if Labor doesn't allow this legislation to go through?
Well, we've seen that Labor's divided on it. Ed has expressed one view, Mark Butler, Nick Champion and others have expressed a very different view. They've expressed a view that the coalition should be allowed to get on with our mandate to get rid of the carbon tax. No one wants the carbon tax. Business doesn't want it. Individuals don't want it. Families don't want it, communities don't want it. No one wants it other than a number of individuals within the Labor Party. They need to listen to that, they need to stop having this tin ear, and they need to allow us to get on with the job of repealing it. Now, whether they have a fixed price tax in the form of a carbon tax or a floating price in the form of an ETS, it's still a tax. And we have said that we are getting rid of the tax in order to allow for business, individuals and families to decrease their cost of living and to allow them to plan with certainty for the future.
Kelly O'Dwyer, Ed Husic, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on AM Agenda today. Now, we will be back after the break with the latest news from the News Centre, including the latest in the United States, and a deal done, but a vote on that just hours away. Stay with us.